So the question is this: is it a disease? And if so, how is it a disease? So in the world of medicine, we always have to follow something called a medical model, right? And I think like way back in the day of the Greeks and stuff, they had medical models that were like based on other things, like humoral model, that was one of them, I think, where they had humors running through their body and you had to release the humors in order for them to stabilize. And there was bloodletting, they would let the demons out and drill their skulls. And like, so these are the medical models that they were following, which seemed primitive, but at the time I think they were very high tech, maybe. So, but today we have a medical model, right? And so the medical model is a disease model. That's what it's called. It's called the disease model. So we're very sophisticated. And basically the disease model says in order for something to be a disease, a biological illness, there has to be an organ or an organ system. There has to be a defect for whatever reason. And then there have to be symptoms because of that defect. And so, for example, something like diabetes, the organ would be the pancreas. The defect would be a decrease in beta islet cells. And then the symptoms would be high blood sugar and kidney disease and eye disease and all of the things. Cancer, right? Liver cancer. The organ is the liver. The defect is an overgrowth of normal cancer cells and a lack of clearing of old normal liver cells. And then a tumor forms, and that's what cancer is, right? So that's the defect and the symptoms. And then you get like liver failure and you turn yellow and all the things. So the question is, how does addiction fit into this model, right? This model of disease. And so to start, the organ, right? The organ system, central nervous system, specifically the brain, right? So the brain is a really, really complex organ, and we do not understand even a fraction of what it's capable of. But we do know that it is a very complex electrical and chemical dynamic, like constantly moving organ. And so because the brain is what actually controls everything about our lives, right? From our breathing and blinking of our eyelids to our ability to communicate and our behaviors, our movements, everything, the brain, our emotions, our thoughts, right? Our choices, our ability to think things through, rationalize or deduce or whatever, these are all brain functions, which means if the brain is broken, then any of those things could be damaged. Any of those things could be symptoms, right? My emotions changing could be the result of a brain defect. My behaviors changing could be the result of a brain defect. So there are two parts of the brain that I want everybody to know. The first part would be the midbrain, right, which is a very old, primitive part of the brain. And I often refer to it as the tiger because it's primitive and angry. But it lives deep inside. It is completely subconscious. We have no control over it. And it is a life or death processing station. So it has nothing to do with choice or goals or weighing pros and cons. It simply says, I'm going to die. I need to take action in order to not die. Right? Or we as a species are going to die, so we need to take action to not die out. That's what the midbrain does. That's it. This whole role, right? And it does this in part through a reward system, our reward system. So we have to find pleasure in the things that keep us alive. So things like eating, food and drinking, procreating. These things have to be enjoyable to trigger our reward center to say, hey, yeah, this is good, we should keep doing this, right? So the midbrain naturally does three things. It encourages us to eat and drink, it encourages us to run away or fight predators, and it encourages us to procreate, to perpetuate the species. That's it, that's all it does. And we have no control over it. It's completely subconscious, and it's operating at a level where it's deciding, do we need to eat or are we gonna die? Do we need to drink or are we gonna die? The other part of the brain that I think is important to understand with addiction is the cortex, the frontal cortex. It's this part of the brain, frontal cortex. And it is the part of the brain that makes you, and me. It's the part of the brain where our personality sits, our willpower, our choice, our ability to think and rationalize and make decisions. That is the part of the brain where all of our skills are kept as well. So, for example, if I'm really skilled at playing a sport, I may have the physical ability in a different area of my brain, right? To move my arms and legs in such a way that makes me able to throw a basketball or hit a ball. But the skill to know how to coordinate all of that to play the game well is in the frontal cortex. So our skill pathways are laid out in that frontal cortex, along with all of our other personality determinants. So drugs, and when I say drugs, and from my perspective, from the biological world, right, from the biological perspective, when I say drugs, I mean all addictive drugs, including prescribed medications, legal ones like alcohol and or marijuana, as well as all of the illicit drugs that we think of as drugs. Okay, so anything that releases high levels of a reward chemical into our midbrain, that's what I'm talking about when I say drugs. Drugs work in the midbrain. So for many years, we believed that addiction was this like moral failing and you were just this bad person, right? Which would indicate a cortex problem because that's where our morals and values are located. However, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I don't know, there was a scientist, Dr. Olds, and his other scientist friends. They did some stuff with mice, and they took mice and they took little probes and they stuck the little probes in the little mice brains, and basically they stimulated the mouse brain, and they let the mouse hit a lever to see if they would stimulate their own brain, and they found that they had no interest in it because the probe was in the cortex. But serendipitously, when that probe was pushed a little bit further, it got into the midbrain, the mouse would then hit the lever and it would stimulate its reward center over and over and over until it died. It wouldn't even like play with other mice or do anything else. It just wanted that reward. And that was the beginning of the study of the neurobiology of addiction, because we started to discover that the reward center was a driving force in all of this. But we know that mice don't come from bad homes, and they're not products of the public education system, and they don't join gangs and all of the things that we sort of like to label the people who use substances as. Mice don't have the ability to do because they don't even have a frontal cortex, right? So these mice, though, are hitting this lever to the exclusion of all their responsibilities. Right? A mouse's responsibility is to eat, sleep, and procreate and play with the other mice. And they weren't doing that. They just hit the lever. So we saw a very similar pattern that we see in humans who are also addicted to highly rewarding substances. So in addiction, in true addiction, the disease process, the brain gets rewired and it gets changed in such a way that the reward center actually believes that it needs these highly rewarding substances in order to feel normal, just like it needs food and water and whatever else to survive to feel normal, right? So there's an actual change, a physiological, neurobiological change that happens in the brain when someone develops addiction. So the brain now believes that it needs dopamine, high-level dopamine, highly rewarding substance comes from drugs, right? And for anybody who's never been addicted in their life, the example that I always use is that if you were in the desert and you were dying of thirst, you were on day 5, no water, you're literally dying, your organs are shutting down, you're not gonna live another 24 hours unless you get some water, and I were to approach you with a bottle of water and say, hey, you can drink this water, but if you do, I'm gonna take your kids, your bank account, your house, whatever. There is not a person on earth who's biologically capable of refusing that water, because in that moment, the midbrain is active, right? That survival mechanism's active. And the frontal cortex, which is where we value our families and our jobs and all the things we have, right? Our values are in the frontal cortex. That's shut down when the midbrain is awake and going, oh my God, we have to survive. And so the midbrain's saying, drink the water, drink the water, drink the water, forget all the consequences. And so we would drink the water. And once the midbrain is satiated, the frontal cortex comes back online. It comes back online, and it comes with a bunch of guilt and shame and self-reprimand because you just gave up everything you valued for some water, right? And then the process of trying to manipulate your stuff back and all of that happens. But then it may only be a matter of time, an hour or 2 hours before that midbrain turns back on again because it really needs water still. That little bottle wasn't enough. And so this is what's happening in the addict brain over and over and over, except instead of water, it's saying I need dopamine, high level dopamine.